Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 19 of Book 2 of the Royal Rangers series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. The new Iberian ambassador was an incredibly tall and thin man, standing well over 190 centimeters. He was aged around 40 and had thick black hair slicked back from his face with a scented pomade. His skin was swarthy, and he had a large hooked nose set between prominent cheekbones. His eyes were dark, almost black, Maddie thought, and his eyebrows were thick and bushy. They too were black, with no trace of gray in them. She wondered if he perhaps dyed his hair. He wore a richly brocaded red and gold tunic, with the national symbol of Iberian, a griffin, on the left breast. He was accompanied by a retinue of only 4 attendants, since he had been warned that the official dinner was to be a small affair only. "My apologies again for such a small gathering, Don Ansalvo," Cassandra said as they were all seated at the dining table in the large hall. "Normally, I would have arranged a larger group to welcome you. But as you know, my husband and our Ranger Corps Commandant are absent at the moment, so it's just us." Just us was Cassandra herself, Maddie, Dimone, and Lord Anthony, the castle heirloom chamberlain. Don Ansalvo waved the apology aside. "A smaller gathering gives us the opportunity to get to know each other more closely," he said. "And besides, who could complain about a gathering that contains 2 such beautiful ladies?" He made a graceful hand gesture that encompassed Cassandra and Maddie, at the same time contriving to bow forward from the waist, in spite of the fact that he was seated. Maddie caught Dimone's eye and rolled her own eyes. Dimone hid a grin from behind his napkin. Iberians, Maddie had been told, were well known for their effusive compliments and exaggerated sense of gallantry. Don Ansalvo looked at her now, his perfect white teeth showing in a smile, and she bowed her head toward him in recognition of his remark. "You're too kind, Don Ansalvo," Cassandra said. He looked back at her. "Tell me, my lady, what is it that has taken Sir Horace away from the castle?" He had been informed of Horace's absence when he arrived, but the reason hadn't been stated. Cassandra shrugged. "It's a relatively minor matter, but one that requires his attention." Don Ansalvo tilted his head to one side. "A relatively minor matter?" he repeated. "What is it, exactly?" Cassandra wasn't keen to discuss Heirloom's internal politics with the new ambassador. Heirloom and Iberian were at peace, but the Kingdom of Iberian had a reputation for meddling when other countries were having problems. She indicated for Dimone to answer, feigning disinterest in the matter. "A small group of hotheads and rabble-rousers are trying to stir up the people," he said. "It's not a big problem, but Sir Horace thought it best to stamp it out before it became one." Don Ansalvo nodded, leaning back in his chair while he considered the answer. "And he is right," he said. "Any sign of rebellion must be stamped out quickly. We have a problem of our own in Iberian." "And what might that be, Don Ansalvo?" Maddie asked. She sensed her mother's reluctance to discuss the Red Fox clan, and thought this was a way to steer the conversation away from them. Don Ansalvo favored her with a rather patronizing smile. "It's nothing that need worry such a gem of female pulchritude," he said smoothly. She smiled back, forcing the expression onto her face. "And yet, I'd be interested to know," she said. He shrugged. "As Sir Dimone says, hotheads and rabble-rousers. 2 of our southern provinces are seeking to secede from Iberian and form a separate nation. Naturally, we can't allow this to happen." "Naturally," Maddie said dryly. She was willing to bet that the provinces in question were rich in farmland or natural resources. Don Ansalvo studied her briefly. He didn't seem to notice the cynical attitude behind her reply. But then, Maddie thought, he was a diplomat and had years of experience in masking his true feelings. She shifted slightly in her seat. In spite of her misgivings about wearing formal clothes once more, Maddie was enjoying the dinner. The blue gown that her mother had chosen for her was an excellent choice, and she knew it suited her, but it was a fraction tight around the shoulders. Don Ansalvo took a sip of his wine and turned his attention back to Damone. Maddie had the distinct impression that he preferred to discuss important matters with a man, rather than with a girl like herself, or even her mother, the Princess Regent. "But tell me, Sir Damone, what is the nature of this rebellion of yours?" he asked. Damone hesitated. He seemed to share Cassandra's reluctance to discuss internal politics with an outsider. But Don Ansalvo had been frank and forthcoming about the problems Iberian was facing, so it was difficult for Damone not to go into a little detail. He glanced quickly at Cassandra, who nodded, almost imperceptibly. "There's a small group of agitators who object to the law that says a daughter may inherit the throne. They wish to return to the rule of male succession," he said. His tone indicated that he would give no further details on the matter. The ambassador nodded slowly. "Ah, of course. Your country is one of the few that allow female succession, isn't it?" he said thoughtfully. "You say they wish to return to the old way. So this has not always been the law in Erluin?" "My grandfather changed the law," Cassandra told him, with a note of finality in her voice. Don Ansalvo stroked his waxed mustache. "It would never do in Iberian," he said. "My people wouldn't stand for it." "If they're anything like you, I'm sure they wouldn't," Maddie thought. She glanced quickly at Damone, and was surprised to see the stony, set expression on his face. It was there for only an instant. Then he realized she was watching him, and smiled brightly at her. She assumed his look of distaste was triggered by the Iberian's unmistakably superior attitude to all things Erluin. Cassandra interrupted Maddie's train of thought with her next question. "So, Don Ansalvo, when do you plan to move into your residence?" As ambassador, Don Ansalvo was provided with a large manor house as his official residence. It was a few kilometers south of the village that sheltered under the castle's protective shadow. Cassandra's question, and the deliberate change of subject, indicated to him that any further questions about the trouble in the north would be unwelcome, and probably go unanswered. He was diplomatic enough to concede. "I thought we would leave at mid-morning tomorrow," he said, "if that suits your arrangements." "As a matter of fact, that would suit me perfectly," she said. "We're about to let most of the castle staff go, and keep only a skeleton staff on duty." Don Ansalvo's raised eyebrows posed an obvious question, and Lord Anthony leaned forward to explain. "At this time of year, the farms in the district are plowing the stubble into the fields and gathering food and firewood for the winter, salting meat and bringing in the late harvest of vegetables," he said. "Most of the castle staff come from local farms. We usually let go as many people as we can spare to help out, and this year, with Sir Horace and most of the garrison absent, we only need a skeleton staff in the castle, no more than 20 people. Even I will be leaving early tomorrow. My daughter and her new baby are coming to visit, and staying at our house in the village." Anthony smiled at Cassandra. "The princess has kindly given me leave to spend time with them." "Of course," Don Ansalvo replied. But then he turned those dark, penetrating eyes on Maddie once more. "But what will you do, princess? Won't it be boring for a lively young woman like yourself to be stuck in a half-empty castle?" "Oh no," Maddie replied, with expertly feigned enthusiasm. "I'll have my sewing and needlework to keep me busy and entertained. You've no idea how diverting Petite Point can be." Don Ansalvo sniffed delicately. "I'm sure I haven't," he replied. Maddie quickly glanced at her mother and read the warning expression in her eyes. "Don't push it." Maddie was still irritated by the ambassador's earlier comments about Erluin's law of succession. She smiled sweetly, now. "Tell me, Don Ansalvo, you said a female ruler would never be accepted in Iberian. What makes you say that?" The Iberian leaned back in his chair and made a languid gesture with one hand. "Iberians believe it is not a woman's place to rule. That is a man's role." Maddie saw the quick warning glance from her mother, but ignored it. With the smile still fixed to her face, she continued, "And what, precisely, is a woman's role?" "It's an important one," the ambassador said condescendingly. "A woman nurtures and teaches. She is the emotional center of the home, She creates an atmosphere of gentility and affection so important for the family. And stays barefoot in the kitchen? There was a hard edge to Maddie's voice now, but Don Ansalvo didn't seem to notice. He considered her statement and nodded. We have nothing against shoes, but preparing meals is an important part of a woman's function, either cooking them herself or overseeing the efforts of servants. He nodded toward Cassandra as he said this. Then, seeing Maddie's obvious disagreement, he continued, But a woman cannot lead a country in time of war. That is a man's job. No woman has ever done so. My mother has been involved in more than one battle in her time, Maddie said doggedly. The smile was long gone now. Cassandra made a gesture for her to desist, but Maddie had the bit between her teeth, and Don Ansalvo's reply had only served to fan her anger further. Yes, he said. Before I accepted this appointment, I studied your mother's past accomplishments, and they are admirable. But the battles she fought in were small skirmishes, not full-scale wars. He bowed toward Cassandra. No offense intended, my lady. I think the Timujai invasion of Scandia might count as a full-scale war. I'm sure the Scandians thought so, Maddie said. He raised an eyebrow at her in polite disdain. And was your mother in command of the Scandian army? He asked. She flushed, realizing she had trapped herself with her hasty words. Well, no, not exactly. As I read the account, the commander was the Scandian Oberjarl Ragnek, and his chief strategist was one of your rangers. That's true, but, in fact, in all of her battles, Princess Cassandra was assisted by one or more of your redoubtable rangers, and her husband, of course, a champion knight. Fighting and commanding armies is not something a woman is cut out for. Yet my mother is practicing with the sword, Maddie said. Don Ansalvo tilted his head to one side, considering the statement. Ah yes, many Iberian ladies of noble birth learn to use the foil of the épée. It develops coordination and balance. But I think a woman with a light sword, facing a fully armored knight, would be at some risk. Don't you agree, Sir Damon? Damon, not expecting to be drawn into the conversation, hesitated awkwardly. He had no wish to offend the ambassador, or Cassandra. I think, he said reluctantly, that in such a case, the advantage would lie with the man. Don Ansalvo nodded, a superior expression on his face. Cassandra hurried to change the subject before Maddie could speak again. Well, that's enough talk of wars and fighting, she said. Don Ansalvo, I'm told you're an expert performer on the lute? The ambassador bowed slightly from the waist. I do have some small skill in that area. Then perhaps you'd favor us with a song, Cassandra said. Don Ansalvo shook his head modestly, making a disclaiming gesture with both hands. No, I couldn't possibly bore you, he began. But one of his entourage had already produced a lute case from beneath the table and was opening it, and passing it to his master. Oh, well, said Don Ansalvo, accepting the instrument. Perhaps one song, an Iberian song about a beautiful lady and a noble knight who dies defending her honor. And more fool him, Maddie thought grimly. She settled back in her chair, her anger at the smooth-talking, condescending Iberian still smoldering. Don Ansalvo smiled at her with what he thought was overwhelming charm, struck a few preparatory chords, and began to sing. Maddie leaned back in her chair. This could be a long night, she thought. All right, that's going to bring us to the end of Chapter 19. Thank you to everyone who joined me. I will see you all next time in Chapter 20. God bless, and have a good one.